So 4 things I want you to take from this talk are: what are the UX performance metrics? How do we measure them? Then how do we set the budgets for them? And how do we make sure that they are implemented as a practice in our DevOps pipeline? So performance budget, how do we define it? It's a limit for pages, which the team is not allowed to exceed. So it's actually a team culture that you build in, so that everybody is aware of that you're within the limits. And they're not just like thresholds, but they're like something that you give as a money, and that has to be very consciously spent, right? Next slide, please. Okay. Some of the examples of performance budgets are like sizing. If you are JavaScript, you can limit the number of the size of your JavaScript bundle. These days, applications are very JavaScript heavy because of new modern techniques like Angular single page applications based on React and whatnot. We also can budget for total image weight because images take a lot of time on slow networks. We can also set the limits on a specific load time. For example, time to interactive, and I'll go over this in a future slide, what it actually means. But you can also set like, time to interactive should be under 5 seconds on a 3G or 4G mobile network. And also you can define your own custom metrics so that you can say, okay, I'm going to use a combination of some metrics and define a threshold for the overall custom metric. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are 3 main goals when you set your performance budget. One is the timing based, in which there are some browser metrics, and we'll go over this in more detail here. Some of which are called time to interactive and first contentful pane. The second is quantity based, as I mentioned before, the amount of the JS JavaScript files and the image size. And there are also rule based performance budget that you can set based on things like page speed index and lighthouse score. So as long as you model your performance budget along these 3 pillars, I think your user experience is going to be really good and very delightful. Next page, please. Okay, 2 clicks. So you can actually level the performance budgets into warning and error. So warning will probably, as you're nearing some thresholds, you can give the development team a warning, in an automated way so that they can take proactive actions to reduce the technical debt that's being accumulated. And this should typically be considered as a non-blocker. You should not stop the development pipeline at this point, but it's good for developers to know that they are about to cross, or they're reaching certain levels where the performance could be hit. The error is when you really do some development, you change the UI, and then you have really exceeded your upper bound limits on the thresholds that you have set, and that could result in a negative impact to your user experience, and it could also be very noticeable. Next slide, please. Okay, and how do you stay under budget? You'll have to make some critical decisions at this point in terms of, if a feature must be rolled out, you have to optimize the existing feature to make room for the new feature that you're putting in. You have to make the tough choice of removing some existing features, and this, if you have a heat map on your web application running Google Analytics or something similar, you can actually see that only 5% of users use certain features on the page. It's not really important, so you can use that data to remove existing features. And lastly, maybe that feature is not important after all. You can vet it out with your business users, and then don't add it on that page which is already overloaded with performance. Maybe you can add it somewhere else. Next page, please. And other important factors to consider is one of the things is you should know your users. Basically, you should know what devices and connection speeds they are on. And also, you should know what type is your site. Is it a news site? Is it a video-heavy site? Is it a text-heavy? Is it a shopping where you are going to do a lot of transactions? So depending on what type is your site, there's no one performance budget, with all those metrics that can fit, universally. You have to pick and choose the metrics depending on what site, what type is your site. Next page. Okay, so here's the grand picture of the user experience metrics, right? This is what happens in the browser, all right? On the left-hand side, you see that the browser requests the page, and on the right-hand side, you see that the page is fully loaded, okay? The first thing that happens is that the server responds with whatever you requested for. Then it goes through a series of events till the DOM content is loaded. And there are many events that I have listed here that happens. These are all available in the web API as metrics that you can capture in a tool and visualize. I'm not going to read through all of this, but I'll be covering that in the future slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so when you consider the user metrics, there are 4 questions you should ask. Is there content? Is the content meaningful? Is it interactable? And are the interactions smooth enough? So user-centric performance metrics are actually based on these 4 pillars. Next slide, please. So is there content? There are 4 metrics that address this. One is the time to first byte, first paint, and first contentful paint. Next slide. Okay, so time to first byte. So the browser has requested the page, right? The time to first byte is when the browser has received the first byte of data of the page that was requested. And you can see that it's very near to where the server has responded, right, with the payload. Next slide. Okay, so now that the payload has been received and the browser is processing it, it loads the DOM content, creates the DOM structure in memory, and is ready to show it. The first thing it does is paints the very first pixel, and that matrix is called FP, or first paint. Next slide. Okay, after that it starts, no, previous slide. Previous slide, please. Okay, so first contentful paint is the event that measures the time between the first when the first piece of content in the DOM is rendered. It's typically the text, because text is rendered faster than an image, but sometimes if the image size is smaller, it could also be that could be as well. And usually the first contentful paint is the first thing that your users will see that is rendered. So that way they know that, okay, I made the request and now I see something is happening. It's not that the page is stuck in the network somewhere. Next slide. Okay, so now this is the second pillar, right? Now that the content is coming, user sees that something is happening. Is the content meaningful? So there are 3 major metrics to measure that. Largest contentful paint, visually complete, and the speed index. Next slide. Okay, so as you can see, we have progressed to the next metric, after first contentful paint, and that's the largest contentful paint. Uh, there used to be a metric called first meaningful paint. This supersedes it, and it measures the time when the largest piece of content within the viewport is rendered. So for example, on a news site, it could be the headline. On a stock market, on a stock site, it could show you your stock that you're interested in, and things like that, or an image. So this can be really customized to your page, but this is the first contentful paint, the first meaningful thing that you want your users to see, right? If they're on a news website, you want them to see the all the headlines first before you show them all the other images that go with it. Next slide. Next slide should show visually complete. Yes, so visually complete. Okay, so now that portion of the browser that the user sees is called as the viewport. Because if you vertically scroll, you can actually see the whole page, but at any given point the viewport is that portion of the browser that the user is seeing on the screen, not the whole page. So visually complete measures the time for the content within the viewport to be fully rendered. Next slide. So there's a score, that's a mathematical calculation called as the speed index, which is based off of the visually complete metric. It's a score of how quickly the visual content is rendered within the viewport. As I mentioned, the viewport is that portion of the browser that is currently visible on your screen. So there's a calculation that's done on the visually complete to show how quickly the content was rendered. In single page applications, it may be that the users see a blank screen and then they immediately see the content that was supposed to be displayed. But in other places, other frameworks, it may be just gradually rendered. So speed index is a score of how quickly that rendering took place. Next slide. So we come to the how is the content interactable, and there are some three major metrics that measure that. One is the first input delay, total blocking time, and time to interactive. First input delay is let's say the user clicks or types something, but the server does not respond. So the time taken between the time the user responds and the browser actually gives back the response is called the first input delay. Next slide, please. Okay, and there's also a complementary metric to go along with FID called as the max potential first input delay. It actually measures the maximum possible first input delay based on the duration of the longest task. So as you know, today we are living in a very Java-centric based web development world. So JavaScript can really block the main thread, so to say. So this actually measures the time that the JavaScript took the longest time to execute, so that when the main thread is stuck, we know that we cannot interact with the site. We have to wait for that JavaScript processing to complete before we can do anything. Next slide. Total blocking time is actually measured as the duration of the JavaScript task between the first contentful paint and the time to interactive. So as I said, the time to interactive is measured as, I think it's in the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So now that the main thread is executed and we have up to 5 seconds with no network activity or JavaScript task being loaded, that time is actually called as the time to interactive. Okay, that's when the user actually sees and can interact properly with the website. Next slide. Okay, then there are a couple of metrics. So now that you have rendered everything and the user can interact with the website, the last pillar is, are the interactions smooth? For example, if there is animation on your site, the frame rate will determine whether the user experience was jittery or whether it was smooth. And cumulative layout shift, that's another important metrics to capture, which actually says, when you go, for example, to browse a site and you're viewing something, and then an ad pops up out of nowhere and the content actually shifts, that can create a real bad user experience, especially if, let's say, for news websites and all, that's fine. But if you're, let's say, you're shopping something and the user was about to click a button and the content shifted, it can lead to user frustration at that point. Next slide. So we have been through a lot of metrics. Now we have a good understanding of what it means. So where do we begin? So what Google has done is, for 2020, they have defined something called as core web vitals. So these, what their take is that if you focus on these three metrics, you should be at a very good position, compared to where you are, which is the largest contentful paint. We already covered that. First input delay, covered that as well, and CLS. So these are some of the numbers that they have given. Like, for example, LCP, if it is happening within 2.5 seconds, it measures the loading metric of your website. The FID measures the interactivity aspect of your website, and then the CLS measures the visual stability. So these are some of the numbers for reference that they have given. Next slide. Okay. So I wanted to give a visual representation. I know I have given a timeline representation earlier on LCP and all that, but how does it actually look? This is where I wanted to show that, on the first frame you see FCP, and on the second frame you see LCP. And FCP is, the first contentful paint. As you can see, there's the one that is highlighted in green is the FCP, but it's not the most meaningful content for your users, right? In the second frame, you see LCP, which is what, and it can be customized for your site, by the way. There are some tags that you can use to indicate which is the LCP for your site. And that's the thing that's the most meaningful for your users. That's what you want them to see. Next slide, please. And here's a deeper look at first input delay. As I said, earlier, FID actually measures, if you see at the bottom of the screen, FID actually measures the time taken for the longest JavaScript execution, which actually blocks the main thread, because JavaScript can be asynchronous also, right? That doesn't block the main thread. But if it's going to block it, it's going to be counted as the FID metric. Next slide, please. Yeah, and cumulative layout shift quickly. Like, for example, here the user was actually going to click on the no, go back, but because the content shifted, he or she ended up pressing the submit order button. And then, you have to go through the whole give me my refund kind of a process at that point. and that can lead to user frustration. Next slide. All right, so couple of this was supposed to be on automation, but I really wanted to cover the metrics first, because that way we know what automation is the easy part. Understanding the metrics and setting threshold limits for them, that's the hard part. So there are two main open source tools today. One is that I like. There are many more players in this arena. But I like Lighthouse CI because that's directly from Google. It integrates very well in the build process. And also with your CI CD providers like Jenkins or Circle CI or whatever you have, it has hooks to plug into those. Gimbal is also based off of Lighthouse, but it has a little bit better dashboard and viewing and gives you a little bit more flexibility and control. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so two main things to implement performance budget and automate it. First is the module bundler. Webpack is a great example, and it does notify when your assets like HTML, JavaScript, images, CSS exceed the specified limits. And also continuous integration with the Lighthouse CI. It integrates also with GitHub Actions, and you can actually configure it to run on every pull request into your repository. Next slide. Yeah, so this is, I just wanted to cover this briefly. This is the Lighthouse architecture. There are two main things. One is the gatherer and then the actual audits. So gatherers actually, the metrics that we covered before, right? Those 10 plus metrics. This gathers all of those and sends it over to the audit. And audit actually runs your specified rules to say, okay, this is what I got, and this is what I'm supposed to set the rules and the thresholds, and then it reports it back to in a dashboard called the Lighthouse report. So all this runs in a continuous fashion in your browser, and the users, they really don't know this is happening because it's supposed to be running in the background asynchronously. Next slide, please. I try to wrap this up quickly. I know we have gone way over time due to the technical difficulties. So just a couple more slides and we should be done. Okay, and this site actually gives you an idea of how to budget your model your budget in response to TTI, the time to interactive. So if there are sliders on this side where you can see that, okay, if my HTML is this much and if my CSS is that much and so on, you can slide them, and then you will get a estimated time to interactive at the top, which will say, okay, yeah, you are within your budgets for this rule. It's kind of like a rules engine that's built for you, and you can actually download that budget.json file that it generates, and then you can integrate it with Lighthouse CLI to set your performance budgets, and then constantly your processes will monitor them. Next slide. So discussion on web performance would not be complete without understanding what is RUM and SUM. So RUM is real user monitoring and SUM is synthetic. So RUM actually collects real-time data from your browser using JavaScript hooks and web APIs, and it sends data to a backend server. It's live and in production, and it can it's unpredictable kind of, because your users could use a variety of hardware and software combinations. You really don't know where your users are coming from. That's the unpredictability portion that you get insights into with RAM, basically. Some is the synthetic part, so you have to be a little bit proactive, and it's also known as lab testing. You can run it as scheduled intervals, in prod or non-prod, and it's kind of predictable because your hardware and software combinations. If you're going to test it with a new version of Chrome or Firefox, you can use some to do that. Or if you're going from Windows 7 to Windows 10 or a new operating system version, you can actually use some to get real-time insights on how your user experience is going to be. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways from this, and this is the last slide actually, there are a couple more, but those are not important. Those are just for references. So what we have learned today in this talk is, first thing, choose the metrics based on what type your site is. Define the budgets for them. Use the tools that I mentioned in this presentation. Start measuring them. You can use Chrome DevTools to start measuring them. See what your current state is. And then integrate it with the CI/CD tools like Gimbal or Lighthouse CI. So with that, we come to the conclusion of this presentation. And I'm not sure, Paramita, if we have time for any questions, or we can go directly to the panel. Yes, great question. And I'm glad somebody mentioned this. So recommended tools, you always start with Chrome, DevTools, run it on your local, because sometimes you don't have a public website, right? You could be working on for your intranet folks, for your company, right? It's not a public site, but still the user experience matters, because it could be an HR site, it could be something that is for your company bulletin or something like that. But how early? As soon as possible. As soon as the business, you have the discussion with the business, over the requirements and all, we should start thinking of UX performance at that point. And also, as I mentioned before, there are critical trade-offs to be made. Do not surprise the business by saying, okay, it was supposed to be on this page, why is it not on this page but somewhere else? So those discussions should happen as early as possible, and it should not be done just by the US developers or application developers. It's a team effort. It has to be agreed upon by everybody in the team. All right. Second question, how to get the speed of the page using any network tool of browser, how to get LCP, FID, etc. Yes, so the best place to start for this is web.dav site, the web.dev site, and it has detailed explanations for everything that I talked about today, including what the metrics are, how does it impact the user experience, what can you do to improve those metrics, and also how what was the last part? Yeah, how it impacts, and basically how to integrate it with Lighthouse or Gimbal. So web.dev is your place to start. And network tool, yeah, there's a network tab on DevTools in Chrome. So you can always see how the network responses are, because chances are if your users are going to be on a virtual device or a really slow network, that can be used to track. And there are other enterprise tools like Thousand Eyes, and I'm not remembering the other tools right off the top of my head, but there are many network tools that can be used at an enterprise level.